Okay, let's shift our attention now and talk a little bit about economic systems. So, economic systems. What's economic systems? Well, economics, if you take a step back and define economics basically is human behavior when facing scarcity. I mean, that's really what economics is, right? And there's scarcity exists. All resources, and we talked about resources in an earlier video, all resources are scarce, or at least in a finite number. And then you juxtapose that next to unlimited wants and needs, and scarcity exists. And so how do we behave in the face of scarcity? How do we behave as individuals, as communities, and then as nations? And an economic system is sort of marries together sort of the economics and the government or political side, and the outcome of that largely is policy, you know. And every economic system has to answer three questions. So the three basic questions are what to produce, how to produce it, and then who gets to consume or use it. And, you know, so long as an economic system can answer those three questions, it's a viable economic system. It may not be an economic system you want to live under, but it's viable in the sense that it can answer those three questions. And if you go back over history, over the centuries, the millennia, I mean, there have been many different economic systems. There have been monarchies and feudal systems and mercantilism and just all kinds of different ways in which individual societies have dealt with this. We're going to limit our discussion today to sort of two the main sort of economic systems you see today. But again, so long as an economic system can answer those three questions, it's considered viable. So let's start off with capitalism. Capitalism is a system, an economic system, based largely on the market constructs. And if you think or remember to an earlier video, what's it take to have a market? You have that buyer, seller, and they have to agree upon price and quantity. And that market structure is the sort of the underpinning of a capitalist system. The father of modern economics, the father of sort of modern capitalism, is a fellow by the name of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, who in 1776 wrote a multi-volume work called Wealth of Nations. Wealth of Nations. In which he did a lot. Wealth of Nations is, it's actually multiple books. It's nice and thick, and he covered a lot of territory in Wealth of Nations, up to and including specialization. I mean, he has this example of pin manufacture, and he basically foresaw or foretold what centuries later Henry Ford would do in terms of the production line. And anyway, but the thing about Adam Smith, the thing that he gets credit for is, something called the invisible hand. And I want to read you an excerpt of, because to my knowledge, the term invisible hand only shows up one time. But, so let's see here. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So what's he talking about? He's talking about self-interest. And the basic underpinnings of this is by, you know, in industry, by pursuing self-interest, not only do you benefit the firm as a whole, but you know, the side result is a benefit, overall benefit to society. Now, key to this is this idea of laissez-faire, which is sort of the government, you know, keep out, right? The government shouldn't be involved uh, in sort of the economy. And you have to understand, he was writing this in 1776. So it was the predominant economic system was mercantilism, right? So the crown would issue writs or contracts to private companies like the East India Trading Company, and they would basically work as monopolies. And you know, the government made winners and losers and sort of dictated all of that. And he was saying, no, that's not the way it should work. The government should sort of you know, laissez-faire, hands off, and let the competition sort of dictate winners and losers in the market. The most critical part to understand, though, is who owns the resources. In this construct, resources are owned by the private sector. And if you recall, again, we talked about this before, private sector, firms and households, not the government. So it is in fact the firms and households, the private sector, that determines what's produced, how it's produced, and who gets to participate or consume. And then so the three questions then, that's sort of decentralized, meaning there is no sort of centralized government authority that's determining that. It's decentralized in the private sector and determined among firms and households. And this, Wealth of Nations was an almost immediate hit. And he became very famous, became, you know, very wealthy, and was sort of a rock star in the late 1700s. And this was really sort of the Bible and sort of the founding of what we now think of as modern economics. And this continued until 1848. In 1848, well, it continued past 1848, but by 1848, there were those that were looking at capitalism and seeing some problems with it. I will say this: Adam Smith, when he is misunderstood, he's usually misunderstood in terms of self-interest, right? People say, you know, in the 80s there was a movie, Greed is Good, and they misinterpret self-interest as greed is good, and that's not it at all. Self-interest is inherently neutral. You know, think about it this way: you're human, you have to eat. Eating is a self-interest. Now, how you eat may be, you know, gluttonous and horrible and not good at all, or, you know, how you eat may be you know, beneficial to others, and you know, you can still get the food you need and take care of others, and so it can be you know, gregarious and help those around you. So, you know, again, self-interest is sort of neutral. How you pursue it, though, can either be, for lack of better terms, good or bad. Okay, so 1848, a fellow by the name of Karl Marx, that's an M, looks at some of the abuses he sees around him in the capitalist system, and has a conference. And so the command economic system, which, you know, normally we talk about as either communist or socialist, sort of giving credit to Karl Marx. So he has this conference in London in 1848, and the byproduct or outcome of the conference is a fairly small, readable little publication called the Communist Manifesto. And Communist Manifesto. And it is pretty small. And basically there's 10 tenets that he goes through and talks about But as you can imagine, it's the sort of counter to this. He saw abuses in the capitalist system and recognized that labor didn't fully participate or enjoy the fruits in a proportionate manner. So, the whole idea is the owners of the capital benefit off the backs of the labor, and labor should rise up, and capitalists should sort of be done with. And the net result, though, is that the opposite of laissez-faire. So government needs to be involved directly in the system, and so it's not a matter of self-interest. Self-interest is NA, and what he advocates for is basically resources to be owned by the government. So resources are owned by the government, and the three questions that we referred to, that's centralized, right? It's centralized in the hands of the government, and the government gets to decide, what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets to consume and benefit from it. I'm not going to read all of the 10, but it's talking about the heavy progressive income tax, all property and land to remain in public domain, government, confiscation of property of all rebels, immigrants, people that leave the country, abolition of inheritance, and again, he saw the solution to capitalism as the government sort of taking control, and there you go. And in the modern era, these are sort of the two competing economic systems. Now, I will say this: a couple comments here, maybe 3, 4, I don't know. The first comment is Marx wasn't wrong. There were abuses in the capitalist system. You can't fault Marx for his observations because, in fact, there were gross abuses in terms of, child labor, working conditions, and just the way in which a lot of the early industrial revolution sort of evolved. The interesting thing is the conference was held in London because he thought London was sort of ripe for his ideas, but as we now know, this took effect first in 1917 in Russia. So it was the revolution in Russia, overthrow of the Tsar and the monarchy that led to this being put into effect. Second comment. Okay, so there is no country today that is purely a capitalist country, and no country that's purely a command country. Now, you may be thinking, "Oh, Mr. Nixon, how about the U.S.? We're a market, we're capital." Yeah, we are predominantly a capitalist or market-driven, but we have a lot of government control and involvement in the economy, and so all economies are mixed economies. Yes, we're predominantly market, but lots of government involvement. You may say, well, what about North Korea? North Korea has got to be the perfect example of a perfect command structure, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Even North Korea is a mixed economy because I guarantee you there's a market. There's a market activity in North Korea called the block market, because anytime, again, economics is already in you. Right? It's all in us. The basics of economics, the basics of decision making, when facing, wants and needs and resources, anytime there are people together, there's always a market. Now, if it's illegal, it's called a black market. So I guarantee you there's a black market in North Korea that operates outside of the official government constraints, and so again, yeah, it's predominantly a command system, but there's no doubt some market activity. Next comment. Yeah, which one's better? Well, here's my only comment I'll make on that. Just check your history books, right? I mean, the reality is the number one economy in the world is the United States, and we're predominantly a capitalist system. But the number two economy is China, and China is a command system. So in that sense, China has come a long way in terms of learning and benefiting from the market activities. Most of the time, most of history has shown that this is really, if you look at when the Germanys were reunited, East Germany and West Germany, and that was an interesting case in that every measurable standard, West Germany was better off than East Germany. The same thing will happen when the Koreas reunite. I mean, every measurable standard, South Korea is going to be better off than North Korea. You look at current communist and socialist nations like, Cuba and Venezuela. Again, the preponderance of history shows that the problem with having the government decide these questions is it's not always efficient and socially optimal. Not that this is a perfect system. There are problems with this system. And again, every system in the U.S. is a mixed system. But, my final comment is this. Socialism, especially, among some younger Americans and adults, seems to be sort of gaining in popularity, or at least, you hear a lot about it in the media. And this always cracks me up when I ask a student. I had students come to me and want to, debate and talk about it. Mr. Dixon, I'm a socialist. And when I ask them, well, why? Why are you a socialist? Because I believe in social issues, and social issues are important. And my response is, that's great. And I agree, social issues are important, but that's not what being a socialist is. Being a socialist is letting the government, to more or less, degrees, decide what, how, and who, in terms of what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets to consume it. And yeah, historically that has not worked out too well. So anyway, all right, I'm going to end this video and then on to the next. Let's talk about trade.